I am Rafael Fernandez de Castro. I'm the director of the Center for U.S. Mexican Studies at UC San Diego, and I'm very happy to welcome you all to this webinar on the request of Washington to extradite some Mexican officials and non-officials. I'm very happy to do this with Héctor Cárdenas, the president of COMEXI, el Consejo Mexicano de Asuntos Internacionales. Thank you, Alejandro. Thank you, Vanda, and thank you, Chuck. Héctor will introduce you properly. But let me ask Mariana. Please, Mariana, could you explain our audience how can they listen to this either in English or in Spanish? Adelante,
Yes.
Mariana López, por favor.
Yes, thank you. Good morning, everyone. We'll be offering simultaneous interpretation in English and Spanish during this meeting. If you wish to hear the speakers in English or Spanish, please click the interpretation button at the bottom right corner of your Zoom screen. You'll see a globe icon that will appear right after these instructions. If you're joining us via the Zoom smartphone app, select your language by clicking More or the three dots in the bottom right corner of your screen. Select Language Interpretation, then choose English or Spanish and click Done. If you wish to hear only the interpreter and not the original speakers, be sure to click Mute Original Audio. Buenos días a todos. Estaremos ofreciendo interpretación simultánea al inglés y español durante esta reunión. Si desea escuchar la interpretación en inglés o español, haga clic en el botón de interpretación en la parte inferior derecha de su pantalla Zoom. Verá un icono en forma de globo terráqueo que aparecerá justo después de estas instrucciones. Si nos acompaña a través de la aplicación Zoom para teléfono inteligente, seleccione su idioma haciendo clic en donde dice Más o en los tres puntos en la esquina inferior derecha de su pantalla. Seleccione Interpretación del idioma, elija español o inglés y haga clic en donde dice Listo. Si desea escuchar solo al intérprete y no a los presentadores, asegúrese de hacer clic en Silenciar audio original. Back to you, Rafael.
Thank you, Mariana. Héctor, could you introduce our panelists, please?
Happy to do so. Lovely to see everybody, and thank you everybody for joining. I have a pleasure of presenting a really great panel to talk about this important topic. I'll start with Vanda Felbab-Brown, who is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, and one of the leading international experts on organized crime, illicit economies, drug policy, and non-state armed actors. Vanda's work has focused extensively on Mexico's security challenges, cartel dynamics, fentanyl trafficking, corruption, and the complex relationship between enforcement strategies and institutional capacity. And Vanda, I know you bring to today's discussion a very deep comparative understanding of how organized crime interacts with states, communities, and political systems, which is, I think, in part at least what we're going to be talking about today. So welcome, Vanda, to today's seminar. I'd like to also introduce Alejandro Celorio, who is a professor of diplomatic law and senior international counsel at Guernica 37 Center. Alejandro is a distinguished Mexican diplomat and international lawyer who served as legal advisor or lead counsel to Mexico's Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He's played a very central role in some of Mexico's most important recent international legal matters and diplomatic negotiations, including issues involving the kinds of topics we'll be talking about today, sovereignty, transnational litigation, and the legal architecture of Mexico's foreign relations. And I think that, Alejandro, your experience will be particularly valuable in understanding extradition, bilateral cooperation, and the legal and diplomatic dimensions of U.S.-Mexico relations. So welcome, Alejandro, to today's seminar.
Gracias.
I'm also very pleased to welcome Chuck DeVore, who is Chief National Initiatives Officer at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. Chuck is a former U.S. Army intelligence officer, public policy analyst, and keen observer of Mexico, national security, and border security issues. What Mr. DeVore brings is a practitioner's understanding of intelligence, security threats, and the ways in which developments in Mexico are interpreted within U.S. policy and security circles. I believe that his perspective will help us examine how extradition requests, organized crime, and cross-border insecurity are viewed from the United States, particularly in the context of a changing national security debate. So welcome, Chuck, to today's webinar.
Thank you.
Thank you, Hector. Let me remind all of you that we have a a question and answers at bottom. Please send your questions and we will ask our panelists to answer your questions. We want this webinar to be as interactive as possible, so please send your questions. So let's start with the context, Vanda, Alejandro, and Chuck. I will say that there's a crisis in Washington, Iran, the midterm election is coming. So why this pressure to Mexico now? Could we start with you, Vanda? Could you help us to understand the context?
Oh, thank you, Rafa, and thank you, Hector. It's terrific to be part of this important discussion. Now, one could flip the question around and say, why only now? Certainly, US-Mexico relationship is one of the most important relationships for the United States foreign policy. And the Trump administration, when it came into office, elevated it on par of relations with principal US with large, great powers with whom the United States has either good or difficult relations, but it elevated it to that level. And has been remarkably consistent in what it had been asking of the Mexican government after the sexenio of President López Obrador, where we saw both US-Mexico bilateral cooperation dramatically gutted, and as well where we saw real reduction of effort by Mexican authorities against criminal groups. Now, there is also a specific context, of course, which has to do with the Trump administration being willing to take measures that prior US administrations, including the first Trump administrations, were not willing. Designating cartels as foreign terrorist organizations, and at least unofficially linking USMCA and its review that's underway right now to security issues. But beyond the Trump administration, there's been long understanding that reducing criminality and the way it has grown enormously potent, enormously embedded, enormously dangerous in Mexico requires far more than just chasing the top narcos. It requires reducing the crime politics nexus that has unfortunately grown in the country. And so the question was only, in my view, why until now? And it's likely that some of the evidence, and this is my last word, that came out of extradition of prior actors such as Almayo will have fed the investigations and the evidence for doing the current indictments. But in my view, it had been building up, and it should be no surprise to anyone, even if the exact timing perhaps is not something that was known. But I would also suspect that more indictments are coming.
Thank you, Vanda. Alejandro, what is your take on this?
Thank you very much to Hector, Rafa, my co-panelists. Wonderful to be here. I believe that pressure has always been there. The US has always, like any country, tried to achieve its own interest. And they'll do it in a nicer way, or they'll do it in a less nice way. And I think what we're seeing now, because of the whole crisis of the world on a rule-based order, is that the US might feel more emboldened to do things that wanted to do in the past, because the whole international law and bilateral agreements are very shaky. So the US might want to pursue certain goals, and before they would have resort in different means, more diplomatic, more subtle, and now, perhaps because they're tired, they're frustrated, and we've known this from Trump's first period. They wanted to combat the cartels. It's very lucrative in terms of political gains to talk about doing something and doing something different of what democratic presidents have done and apparently hadn't achieved a lot. So I do believe that it's a matter of the political environment in the US. The elections coming in November is very appealing to the MAGA base. More than 30% of MAGA base, according to Politico at the beginning of this year, a poll, are in favor of military intervention in Mexico. I think is profitable for the White House in terms of the election, but also is pushing the envelope into doing things that we hadn't seen before. You can bomb a boat in the Caribbean, and nothing happens. You can bring out a sitting president from a country and nothing happens. You might sequester a cartel member and there's no consequences. And this is not only in the US. I believe this erosion of international law started when Russia invaded Crimea and nothing happened. Ecuador entered the embassy of Mexico in Quito and there was no a lot of consequence, quite the contrary. Some countries believe that it was more important to fight corruption and drug cartels than respecting diplomatic law. So to end and say, I believe this is just the US pressure by other means, the pressure that we've seen for decades or centuries, by other means that goes in parallel to the world that is changing and the rules that we knew, diplomacy, multilateralism, and the respect to bilateral treaties is being eroded.
So, sorry, let me remind everybody that we expect your questions. So please send your questions to the Q&A bottom. And Chuck, let's go to you. Vanda is telling us that for her, perhaps the Trump administration was a bit too patient with Mexico. Alejandro is telling us that, well, the rules-based world order it's diminished. And so what is your take, Chuck? You've been in the border, you're close to the border, you're in Texas. So what is your take on all of this?
Well, let me first of all, again, thank you for allowing my participation with this important panel. Secondly, let me make it clear that while we are very close with elements of the Trump administration, we do not presume to speak on behalf of the administration. So putting those two key points aside, I'd like to begin by saying that I agree 100% with what my fellow panelist Vanda said. I thought she provided a great explanation and kind of historical picture of what's going on. If I may, I'd like to diplomatically perhaps disagree a bit with my colleague Alejandro and begin by saying that I think a lot of what's driving US policy right now is extreme alarm at what we're seeing in Mexico as the creation of a one-party authoritarian regime under Morena, and not simply an authoritarian regime, but a narco-trafficking regime. I think it's important that you look at the big picture as to how this administration is approaching the problem. The extradition of Maduro out of Venezuela and the pressure on Cuba are all part of a concerted effort to isolate Morena and President Sheinbaum in Mexico. As we know, Mexico has been receiving security assistance from both Venezuela and Cuba on how to best be a one-party authoritarian regime in exchange for energy and money. That tripartite arrangement has been broken asunder, and it will only get worse and more isolating for President Sheinbaum. I believe what this administration aims to do is to eliminate the ungoverned areas in Central and South America and in Mexico. And by ungoverned areas, I mean areas where the Mexican government, as properly constituted, does not exercise complete sovereignty, because these ungoverned areas result in dead Americans as well as dead Mexicans. That's not to the advantage of either nation, both when it comes to trade, rule of law, as well as uncontrolled migration. So I should expect that this administration is going to keep the pressure on, perhaps until the point where Mexico again becomes a viable, competitive democracy, and the level of corruption is certainly significantly less than it is today. So I don't think the midterms are playing into this at all. I think this is part of a long-term strategy that you're likely going to see through the end of the Trump administration.
Thank you, Chuck. There's a few questions there, Hector. Perhaps you want to field that to us. But Chuck, it's do you really think that this the Trump 2.0 administration really cares about democracy in Mexico, about rule of law? I have my doubts. I wonder, Alejandro, you want to say something about that, but I mean, I get what Vanda says, that they very worried about the fentanyl use in the U.S., that López Obrador took too long to recognize that we produce a lot of fentanyl in Mexico. But to say that this Washington is interested in Mexican rule of law and we'll see a diminish of the rule of law in the U.S., it's, I don't know. You want to say something, Alejandro?
Yeah, thank you. No, Chuck, wonderful to listen to you. I don't have all the facts. I don't know if a government is corrupted or not. It calls my attention that Morena is not that different from PRI, that ruled Mexico for 70 years. And had different challenges, but also one party ruling, closer to the left in one point, and then at the end to the right. And the U.S. resorted in multilateralism and other actions. It's worrying to think that Washington would take justice, and it's done it in other countries, but to its trade partner and to its neighbor, to take justice in its own hand and decide, this is what I'm going to do. I understand it's the U.S. interest and what their closest neighbor, but I thought we were friends. And that's what worries me. I do believe there are other means. And there's already an institutional framework that could be used by both, by the Mexican government, current Mexican government, by the U.S., to try to solve a lot of the challenges that we have. Migration, fentanyl, cartels. It's frustrating if they're not used and we don't get results. I understand that. But to take justice in the hands of the U.S. and decide what should happen in Mexico, I believe it's an attempt to the rules that were being used since the end of the World War II. Now, that's what I refer. Is this the new reality, that any country is going to do whatever they want, pursuing their interests? China is going to do it, and Russia is already doing it. So I think it's a slippery slope for the U.S. If we want to continue to be the champion of democracy. There are other means, and there are Mexicans in the government. And President Sheinbaum, I'm sure she wants to do things and work with the U.S., our neighbor, friend, and trade partner.
Well, if I can
Thank you,
here, Rafa, I mean, the United States certainly should care deeply about democracy in Mexico, and it should care about democracy in other countries, including our own. And we have seen the deterioration of democracy in Mexico across the previous sexennium as well. A lot of dismantling of checks and balances, a lot of weakening of institutions. Just recently, the changes to the Mexican Electoral Commission, which was one of the highlights of the pre-authoritarian era. So I think there are deep concerns about democracy, and that are not something that just an outside observer would assess. That many of my Mexican friends are deeply concerned about the significant backsliding of democracy. What I am more worried is whether democracy will be traded, and pressure on democracy will be traded for pressure on fentanyl or pressure on migration. And that to me is a false choice. The United States cannot kill its way out of drug trafficking and criminality problems, and for that matter, Mexico cannot kill its way out of that either. High-value targeting comes with severe limits and grave counterproductive effects. And fundamentally, what needs to be strived jointly as much as possible with the partner countries through US pressure, if the joint effort doesn't work, is to build institutions, rule of law that enable strong civil society, that enables strong investigative journalism, that enables strong rule of law and judicial institutions. And I am concerned that in many countries, the Trump administration has gone completely away from this institutional focus and is heavily focused on the military approach to law enforcement only. And I would posit that focusing on democracy, on checks and balances, on civil society are fundamental to breaking the stronghold that criminal groups have on any country where they are strong, including on Mexico.
Chuck, would you like to say something? The next
Yeah.
question will be about Mexico, about Claudia Sheinbaum's attitude out of response, and Hector will fill us some of the questions here. But go ahead, Chuck.
Yeah, I think it's extremely important to understand that when you have, and Vanda, please correct me if I'm wrong on this, but if I recall correctly, it was the governor of Sinaloa during the election campaign that saw the election apparatus of the main party in opposition kidnapped and held in a large auditorium in the 24 hours leading up to the election and shortly after. Something like this that essentially uses a narco-terrorist to completely disable an opponent's political apparatus on the eve of a gubernatorial election is pretty spectacularly a violation of rule of law. And so when you have something like that happen, of course, then leading to the indictment of Governor Rocha Moya, or I guess former governor, that's exactly the sort of thing I'm talking about that is evidence of such a deep and entwined nature between the narco traffickers and the political elite of Mexico. And while part of me would tend to agree with Vanda about you can't bomb your way or kill your way out of this, I will say that many of the people currently in charge in the Trump administration might be willing to try to kill their way out of it. Because at the end of the day, you could argue that the world certainly has never made a worse place by killing people who need killing. So let me just inject that into the conversation, as unpleasant as it may be.
Thank you, Chuck. Hector,
Perhaps we can introduce a question from the audience here, which I think our three panelists would be able to address. So one of our audience members, who's anonymous, asked, is basically saying, well, there's been this pressure on the Mexican government, and he uses the expression salami slices, like little by little. And so the question is, even though the U.S. government is probably not keen to destabilize Mexico necessarily, what's the likelihood that there will actually be military operations in Mexico that are not commonly agreed to at this juncture? I mean, we're seeing an increase in pressure. Is this leading towards there? Perhaps we can start with Chuck and then Vanda.
Yeah, I wouldn't rule out the possibility, and let me give you an example of how you might conceive of this happening. If you look at the opening moments of the current U.S. operation against the Islamic Republic of Iran, they were instigated when a critical mass of the leadership of the Islamic Republican Guard Corps and the Basij and other higher level leaders met in one place. And you ended up with a decapitation strike that killed a large number of high-level leaders. One could easily imagine that if President Sheinbaum continued to resist the extradition or, extra legally, the expelling of people that the U.S. Is interested in legally, that it might be conceivable that at some point we get the intelligence that there's a significant meeting occurring between high-level cartel officials and even maybe some government officials that are on the payroll, they're on the take. And it doesn't take too much imagination to conceive that there could be a drone strike or some other operation that could see a building mysteriously blown up and the deaths of some 50 people. I'm not suggesting that I approve of such a thing or that it's going to happen, merely that the groundwork has been laid for it to happen.
Alejandro?
Thank you. And I would love Vanda and Chuck to share some reaction to this. It might happen, but it has called my attention that it seems that the Trump administration is building a legal justification around this so-called unwilling or unable doctrine. Repeatedly, the White House has said they don't want our help, they don't want our help. And it seems that in every single salami slice, there's a booby trap in terms of if you don't do what the US wants, that means that either you don't want or you cannot do it. And what calls my attention is any use of force in Mexican territory, military use of force, I believe would require Congress authorization in the US. If it is a law enforcement action, like the way they got Maduro, or is under this bigger idea that, well, the Mexican government cannot prosecute the cartels, cannot find them, or is unable to fight them, then we need to do it. And I wonder if that the limit or what has stopped the US from using force in Mexican territory is some legal justification that could help surpass any challenge from Congress in the US.
Yeah, let me make it very clear. There is no limit. The president, under his Article 2 authority, is the commander-in-chief of the U.S. Armed Forces. It is true that only Congress, Article 1, can declare war, but the president can make war. And that's what you're seeing in Iran. That's what you've seen throughout U.S. history. And what you're seeing, just to wrap up on this thought, or to perhaps to amplify it, is a return to the Monroe Doctrine. And one of the corollaries of the Monroe Doctrine is that the U.S. does not countenance lightly ungoverned spaces. And we see that in Mexico, where there are vast swaths of Mexican territory and the economy over which the Mexican government, as properly constituted, does not have sovereign authority. That's one of the reasons why, if I buy avocados here in Texas, those avocados were likely sold to me by cartel-owned farms that were taken over forcibly from their rightful owners. So that's just the fact. That's just the way things are now. And you have an administration that, frankly, isn't willing to continue to accept the status quo.
Vanda?
Well, I certainly think that the administration can find the legal justification for taking military action in Mexico, especially if that military action was of limited duration, scope, and nature. But the baseline against that judgment is being made is the war in Korea. So there is a lot of scope of actions that could be legally taken in the absence of Congress voting on authorizing a war action. The question, however, is how wise and useful that would be. I mean, it certainly, in my view, could stem from US frustration that the actions taken in Mexico are not adequate from the US perspective. And I think very much that the military option is on the table. I would again point out to our listeners that a lot of action that the Trump administration has taken were fought by many Mexican analysts and even government officials as actions that the US would never take because Mexico was deeply opposed to them, or at least the Mexican government was deeply opposed to them. And yet the Trump administration went ahead. So I think that the military action is on the table. I would also say that the charges put against Governor Ruben Rocha and against 9 other officials, former and current, of the state of Sinaloa should be no surprise. All across 2025, Secretary Rubio and other US government officials were going to the Sheinbaum administration with a well-known list of people whom the US has suspected of being close to criminal groups and demanding actions taken against them. But of course, Claudia Sheinbaum, as president of Mexico, has to be deeply concerned about sovereignty, and as a leader of the Morena party, has to be deeply concerned about her coalition. And there are strong limits to what she has felt she can do, and there are real consequences, be they legal consequences. That said, she has extradited over 90 criminal bosses into the United States in ways that many lawyers in Mexico, Alejandro, chime in, questions the legality of, and she justified that on the national security law grounds. So she could possibly make a similar judgment with Governor Rocha and others. But Look, the most important issue, in my view, the most important element of the US-Mexico bilateral relationship that can bring us forward to much more safer Mexico for people in Mexico, for the United States, is to have joined US-Mexico law enforcement operations with US law enforcement agents on the ground in Mexico participating in them. Not as the lead guys to kick down the door, but returning perhaps with different titles, with different names, to the era of the Felipe Calderon administration, where you had joint fusion centers, where you had US analysts and officers participating, at least in observer mission, in operation. So what we saw with the CIA agent in Chihuahua is what we should be wanting to do on for both countries. This is what will advance us in mapping the networks. Military strikes out of frustration might kill some important drug leaders, but they will be replaced very rapidly, as they have been replaced for decades and decades. Military strikes might take out the old fentanyl or meth lab. It takes 2 days to resurrect them. What can make a big difference is bringing down networks of the operational layer of the criminal groups and their political patrons. And that requires a lot of institutional building and patience on US side. It also requires joint ground actions with US law enforcement, not military actors on the ground in Mexico. And I fear that the more there is a sort of sovereignty Morena party rejection of that notion, as we have seen, for example, in the revelations of the death of US CIA agents, the more the desire the temptation to move to military action will rise in the US. My final comment here is, several weeks ago, I wrote 2 pieces on how the Mexican government could react to US military strikes, and also how the cartels could react to US military strikes. And there is a path of escalation from both actors that I think would be deeply hurtful to Mexico's security and to US security. So, in my view, we should not go down the military action, but to prevent that requires strong ground law enforcement joint action.
Thank you, Vanda. I think it's very clear. Hector, why don't we go to Choc, and if it's fine with you, then we talk a little about what Mexico should do, how you see the response of the Sheinbaum administration. Something else, Hector?
No, let Chuck respond to that, and then we can go to other questions.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Again, I wanted to just follow on to what Vanda said. I agree again with her insightful analysis. I would like to add, though, upon the things that she recommended, all of which are very sound and make a lot of sense, the fact that the U.S. is also focusing on the financial channels. And what we're seeing increasingly is the malign hand of the People's Republic of China in facilitating money laundering and operations of moving money both in and out of America and in and out of Mexico. You may also have seen news, I think it was just yesterday, where the U.S. is examining Mexico's extensive network of consulates in the U.S. And we're doing so because the Mexican political establishment has constantly talked about weaponizing the Mexican diaspora in America against Donald J. Trump. Of course, if we were to do that in Mexico, that's illegal under Mexican law, but somehow Mexico thinks it's okay to do it here. And what you're likely going to see with this emphasis on financial movements is that we're likely going to be uncovering significant amounts of money, both based in Beijing and in Mexico City, that have been spent to improperly influence U.S. political outcomes. This will all be done prior to the midterms, and it will likely result in some significant revelations. Lastly, do not underestimate the fact that as Cuba is under tremendous pressure, it's increasingly likely that some Cuban officials, in striking a deal for amnesty from well-deserved punishment, are likely to turn over to the U.S. vast amounts of the Cuban archives, similar to what happened in the closing days of the old Soviet Union, with the release of the old Soviet archives. Those archives are going to implicate a vast swath of Mexican political and diplomatic leadership. And again, that will have significant negative consequences for the status quo in Mexico.
Thank you, Chuck. Hector?
So there are different questions, and I'd just like to maybe make a synthetical question from the questions from the audience. There's two big strands. So one has to do with the true motivation for these actions, right? If fentanyl trafficking has been down, if the Mexican government has been making a change to its security posture and to its anti-organized crime strategy, then why is there such pressure from the United States at this point? Is it really about reducing drug trafficking? And in that case, why don't we see more on the demand side? And if that's not the only consideration, what are the other considerations that are in play? So maybe we can start with Vanda. Okay.
Well, I certainly think that drug trafficking is at the top of the Trump administration's agenda with Mexico, as it has been with previous administration, including the Biden administration, fentanyl being the dominant drug killing Americans. And we have seen significant declines in the deaths of Americans as a result of fentanyl or meth, both of which are produced in Mexico. But we still have 70,000 Americans dying yearly, a number that is unacceptable. But I think the agenda really should be broader. And Chuck started talking about avocados, for example. I mean, the reality is that many legal, not just illegal economies in Mexico have been taken over by criminal groups, not simply in extortion, but in much more direct participation. The threat of criminal groups to elections in Mexico has grown enormously. It's not just Governor Rocha allegedly kidnapping his opponent. Criminal actors have been deeply influencing elections in Mexico for a long time, and the most extensive manner that we have seen in the 2024 elections. The election of judges creates further vulnerabilities, in my view. And so, there is, in my view, an accumulation of issues that have been present for a long time and that have simply been growing, and where the Lopez Obrador administration was not an adequate partner for the US, and the Sheinbaum administration has done far more, but there are still major outstanding issues that need to be worked on.
Alejandro, you want to say something?
Yeah, certainly. I would like to start by just mentioning about the consular network. It's any country, host country has the ability or the attribution to review how many consulates they have. It's by mutual agreement. A lot of countries meddle in domestic politics. Mexico don't do it. I was a consular officer. I can attest to that. Other countries do it. 2 agents of the CIA were here in Mexico without the governments of Mexico's knowledge in terms that they weren't accredited before the ministry. So moving from there, why the pressure now? I think the pressure has increased because there's frustration by the White House. They've been talking about there's a list, Mexico has to do more, and this has been for years. So I imagine they're moving forward with different actions. And also the pressure works. Because the government of Mexico has done certain things based on pressure. You remember the Canadian athlete, the hitch a ride with the director of the FBI. He surrendered in the American embassy. Embassies cannot accept people surrendering. That there's authorities in Mexico that do that, and then there's extradition. We're accepting non-Mexicans being removed from the U.S. The expulsion of almost 100 Mexicans out of the Treaty of Extradition. So there's cooperation, there's pragmatism. The Mexican government is trying to build a better relation in terms of security with the U.S., but I believe there's a lot of distrust, and that's the point that I want to highlight. A lot of distrust that keeps growing between both governments, and now the government of Mexico is saying, you have 2 agents of the CIA that I didn't know that were working here. I didn't want to have boots on the ground and you're going to do it anyway, or you're asking me to extradite somebody and at the moment they arrive in the US, you offer a plea deal. There's no justice for the victims, and the extradited individual becomes a witness and gives information for others. And it's not that I'm sure the government is not afraid of what the extradited is going to say, but what is the real purpose of extradition? Justice or building a bigger file to put pressure in other countries? There's a good book by Brown University talking about extradition. Less than 8% of the extradited people get a trial in the US. The others get a plea deal. So I think there's distrust. We have the framework, but if we really want to avoid a military action by the US, we need to strengthen our bridges, understand the needs of the United States, and also the US has to understand our needs, because it's not only a one-way street.
Thank you, Alejandro. Hector, if it's fine, we have 15 minutes to go.
Yeah, let's go. Let's keep going with the questions.
So Hector will ask some questions from the public, but let me ask you. I mean, Vanda, you said we need joint operations on the ground. What else, Choc? What else, Vanda? Because I'm a little worried, Choc and Vanda and Alejandro, that I mean the Sheinbaum administration, Morena, and now the Trump administration, they're not very much into institutional building. They've been destroying some institutions. So that's my problem with the Monroe Doctrine in the 21st century, Chuck. That I mean, it's we should build institutions instead of unilateral intervention. So, but what is your take? What else we can do together to avoid or try to avoid what seems to be a very important confrontation that could really sink U.S.-Mexico cooperation? Would you like to start, Vanda?
Sure. Look, I have written for many years about how I think U.S. and U.S.-Mexican law enforcement strategies need to change, one of which is to move away from high-value targeting, however satisfactorily it might feel in a particular minute, to much more comprehensive dismantling of networks and targeting of the middle operational layer. I still believe that's fundamental to both reducing the power of the Mexican criminal groups and their penetration into many economies, as well as reducing violence in Mexico. And as long as we continue positing a policy that's in contradiction, where reducing power drives violence, then the policy will forever be unstable, problematic, and often rejected by the political system where it causes violence. This would be Mexico. I fully agree that institutional building is fundamental. I had talked about it previously. I think it's essential. And I don't think it's a good decision of the Trump administration in Mexico and beyond to reduce emphasis and eliminate funding mechanisms and cooperative mechanisms for institutional building. And I would put in institutional building basic oversight, such as of protection of journalists in the civil society that can point out corruption of business leaders, of political leaders. This year is the most, or the data that just came out points to most deaths and violence against Mexican journalists in an already extremely bad context that we have seen. So something to be very, very concerned about. I also believe that the institutional building translates into extraditions. So I believe there is a strong reason to do extradition. And I actually believe that if those who are extradited do strike plea deals and provide important information on other actors within the network, be it on the political patronage side, or be it in the criminal group side, or be it in terms of who are the money launderers, perhaps Chinese criminal groups, that all is very useful. Another reason, of course, for extradition is that we have seen many cases in Mexico collapse in courts, where there is no plea bargain, and individuals who are criminal actors or who are alleged to be politically corrupt and implicated in criminal networks do not get sentences. They don't make plea bargains. They don't provide information. They walk free. But, and here is the big but, the United States should not be a big brother forever, and perhaps not even for a limited amount of time. So if we always extradite every single individual because we are afraid that the case will collapse, or that there is such political corruption that the case will collapse, then the system will be collapsing. We need to give Mexico a chance to start making cases in which they learn, some in which they succeed, others which will fail. Now, I would not say that this applies to every single actor. When El Mayo was kidnapped into the United States by his by Joaquin Guzman from the Sinaloa cartel, I said the most important element, the biggest gain out of El Mayo's coming to the US is that he will talk about the corruption networks in Mexico. And I strongly suspect that the indictments that we have seen against Sinaloa officials very much come from his information. Perhaps not solely, but to an important extent. So there really needs to be a balance of who gets extradited for network building information, for a sense that the case won't collapse, with who is allowed to stay in Mexico so that the Mexican system can learn. Right now, we are in a situation where National Guardia Nacional people do a routine checkpoint on the highway. They stop a car, they find a weapon, they immediately call the US Embassy and say, do you have anything on this person? Because they don't want to go through prosecutions, investigations in Mexico. And that is not healthy for either country. Final comment here. The big downside of the extent and timeliness of the Trump administration pressure is that it has prevented the Sheinbaum administration from pursuing its important objective of building investigative capacity in Mexico. When Secretary Harfuch and President Sheinbaum took office, they unveiled a very decent, very robust security plan that put strong emphasis on building investigative capacities. Essentially, no progress has been made. Very, very little progress has been made, both because of the obstacles that the Mexican system throws, but also because they are constantly just responding to US pressure to get El Mencho, to get El Jardinero, to get, you know, your narco at, you know, certain top level. And that is producing some important success, but it's also producing really negative effects in continual withering, or at least stalling of investigative capacities in Mexico.
Chuck, if I can ask you a question, building on Vanda's comments right now, is there a feasible set at play in terms of an agreement that the Trump administration could reach with the Sheinbaum administration around security that is not just about high-value targets, not just about pressure, but also about the creation of some institutional mechanism or mechanisms to favor the kind of things that Vanda is talking about? Or is that not in the cards? What's your sense? I know you don't speak for the Trump administration, but you have a sense of what they're thinking.
Chuck, if I could add to that, you've been on the ground. What would be your advice to Omar Garcia Harfuch? I mean, help him. I mean, the guy is trying hard. No doubt he's trying hard.
Well, let me first offer a few roadblocks. I think that it was mentioned briefly, but perhaps not emphasized enough, that the change to appointed judges to elected judges, given the current environment with the narco fusion with Morena, makes judges almost untenable in terms of their neutrality and their application of rule of law. That is a big deal. When it comes to cooperation and the creation of special units, the U.S. has already been burned before by providing elite special forces training, only to see those who were trained end up working as sicarios for these various drug lords. And so we certainly don't want to make those mistakes again either. So I don't know whether it's creating a new institution, having higher pay and better professionalization. Certainly something should be done that hasn't been done before. Maybe something can be done, but again, we have challenges on the U.S. side as well. We have increasing instances of the fantastic sums of money corrupting American law enforcement officials as well as Border Patrol and customs officials. So the corrosive power of corrupt money is not simply resident in Mexico. We are increasingly having challenges in the U.S. as well. I think this is going to be a problem for a long time. And let me just kind of come back to a statement I made previously that is, I think, extremely important from a strategic way of viewing this. The actions in Venezuela and in Cuba are not isolated. They are related directly to Mexico and the desire of the United States to significantly improve its national security south of the border in the context of a rapidly growing and deadly People's Republic of China. America cannot afford, if China decides to move on Taiwan, to have chaos in Mexico or in nations to our south. That's a lot about what has happened recently, both in Venezuela, Cuba, and in Mexico.
Thank you, Chuck. Alejandro.
Thank you, Chuck. With the last comment, it gave me some hope. I do believe, and I'm a firm believer in the bilateral relation, the trilateral with Canada, the USMCA. There are challenges beyond our region. And if Mexico and Mexicans, both in the government and also in civil society, understand that the US is actually worried about what happens in China, how the world is moving, perhaps our understanding of why the US is putting pressure into Mexico is legitimate. They really want the US to be okay, or the opposite, they don't want Mexico to be in chaos, as you mentioned, Chuck. And I think that's the homework that we have. We need to lower the degrees in the volume, start having conversations. They're difficult conversations, but to say, you're asking me, a sitting governor, to be arrested. I cannot arrest that governor because it has a protection being an elected official, but I can put him security just in case there's risk of flight. When the extradition is formalized, a judge will decide if I grant the extradition or not, with a presumption of innocence, the due process, but also being rigorous in the procedure. Give some guarantees to the US that the procedure in Mexico will be legal to the satisfaction of our neighbor. And at the same time, the US perhaps is been waiting too long, but trust more in the institutions and the real effort of the women and men in the Mexican government that are trying to do their best. Because this is a shared challenge that we have. And I end by saying, let's build better and recuperate the institutions that help us build this prosperous North American region, having in mind the challenges that are coming from other locations in the world. As hard as it could be, we need institutions. Because if we don't have institutions, everything is going to depend on how this or that president wakes up in the morning, and it's going to be in detriment to Americans and Mexicans.
Thank you, Alejandro. Hector, why don't we give each one of the panelists like a last comment? So you tell us, how to avoid a confrontation, a military confrontation, because I believe it would be in detriment of the cooperation that we have developed with a lot of efforts during the last 40 years or so. But Hector, what will?
And perhaps you could weave into that just what do you think is what are the options that President Sheinbaum has? In her toolkit to respond in a way that de-escalates. Let's start. We can start again with Vanda then.
Well, I have already highlighted what I think is core to avoiding U.S. unilateral military strikes and U.S. military strikes, even with the joint approval of the Mexican government, since I to believe that will be of limited effectiveness and come with great costs. And that's really developing a mechanism for US law enforcement agents to be on the ground in Mexico in joint operations. And sort of avoid the political showmanship that surrounded the deaths of the CIA agents in Chihuahua. Now, I understand that the 2020 national security law that López Obrador passed, or the Mexican Congress passed during the López Obrador administration in response to the arrest of General Cienfuegos, was, and the national security law is an impediment to that kind of on-the-ground cooperation. But perhaps it would be important to revisit the law and find a way to allow that cooperation.
Thank you, Vanda. Alejandro.
Yeah, just to reiterate, but in some specifics, I think Mexico has to reduce to a maximum its liabilities. You know, if it's of concern of the U.S. that our consular network might intervene in the elections, we shouldn't be talking about the consulates are going to sway the vote in a way or another. I mean, there's no need for that. If we want to talk about we can prosecute criminals in Mexico, we should have a stronger judiciary. So when we lower our liabilities, it might be easier or less complicated to confront and reject some of the proposals of the U.S. We cannot outsource our justice to the U.S. We cannot outsource our law enforcement to the United States. We need to build our institutions in Mexico and show that we can be, as we've been in the past, and we can improve being reliable partners. We're trade partners, and the world is changing, and we're together, and we should face the changes in the world together for the improvement of the lives of our citizens. And I think more than the challenge, that's the opportunity that we have now. Strengthen our institutions in Mexico, propose new institutions in Mexico. Is the extradition treaty is not working? Let's find a way why the extradition treaty is not working. How can we make it better? How can we make it faster? The sharing of evidence. I end this conversation. I appreciate the invitation and the comments, very valuable comments of the panelists in a very optimistic mood. The challenge is big, but I think we can face it together, both countries.
Thank you, Alejandro. Hector, before we go to Chuck, Alejandro has been referring to this pressure that now the Mexican consulate network is facing in the US. We should have a webinar on that because we didn't really properly answer all of those questioning. We'll come back to all of you with that. Chuck, you have the last word, and then Sergio, Hector will wrap up.
Well, again, thank you for the kind invitation. I feel honored. Let me begin by saying that it's our understanding that there are deep fractures within Morena. There is a portion of the party that's more loyal to AMLO and by our view is likely more deeply embedded with the narco traffickers. Certainly anything that can be done to help the president assert proper Mexican sovereignty over both its legal system as well as the economy and its territory would be beneficial for both President Sheinbaum and for Mexicans. Let me give you one example of where this cooperation could be made manifest, which is that the U.S. treaty with Mexico when it comes to the use of the water from the Rio Grande River has not been met on the Mexican side, and it's our understanding that significant amounts of that water is being diverted by Mexican cartels for the cultivation of their crops, some of which would include marijuana. And so clearly this needs to be honored. It's significantly and negatively impacting farmers in Texas. And all we're asking is that the treaty be adhered to and that the drug cartels not be allowed to divert vast amounts of the water. So that would be a good confidence building measure. Lastly, let me just say that by way of optimism, if you look at the world today, if you look at the rapidly advancing use of artificial intelligence and the massive amounts of energy that that's going to take, the additional amounts of copper, which of course Mexico is blessed with, and other rare earth elements that it's going to take to make this new economy realized, When you look at the advantages of North America, of Mexico, the United States, and Canada, there is no reason to believe that our bloc, our economic bloc, and our shared values wouldn't be able to dominate the world economy to the benefit of the citizens of all three nations. So I certainly think that we have the opportunity for a bright future ahead, but let us not fool ourselves about the significant obstacles that we have to overcome to get to this new bright future. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Vanda. Thank you, Chuck. Thank you, Alejandro, for coming to this webinar. And thank you to all our audience. And as Rafael mentioned, this is a continuing effort that we have jointly with UCSD and COMEXI to bring these kinds of conversations to all of you. And we'll be scheduling additional webinars, and certainly one on the review of the consulates, of the Mexican consulate in the United States. So again, thanks everybody. I think this was a very useful conversation that really gave us some insight into the dilemmas that the two countries are facing, and some ways forward. Hopefully, the right people are listening.
Thank you all. Adiós, un
Thank you very
abrazo
much.
a todos.